And I think the first quality of a top-notch recruiter is curiosity. The second thing is a keen listening ability. You don't recruit people when you're talking. You recruit people when you're listening. The third quality, I believe, is what I call extreme empathy. If I want to recruit you, Reed, I have to get inside your head and know what it's like to be you. Fifth quality is persistence and a laser-like focus. Sixth quality is creativity, coming up with a solution to a problem. Seventh one, being a careful observer of stressors in people's lives. The eighth quality is sometimes misconstrued because it's such a harsh word, and that word is ruthlessness. But by that word, I mean never forgetting why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then finally, the quality that is the most mysterious of all is what I call the metaphysics. And that's a kind of a spooky thing that only maybe 1 or 2% of ops officers have.
Do you find that it's pretty often for undercover ops or anything like that, that you're kind of highlighting method acting? Do you have to create a separate character or persona? So I forget what the exact word is in like acting methodology, but it's where, you know, Christian Bale is famous for this, where he becomes that character.
Or Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
Daniel Day-Lewis, excellent actor. He gets into it so much that even when he's not under camera, he's still in that character. Mm-hmm. And that makes it more comfortable to do that, that you're posing as somebody and you want to make sure that you don't want to overact, because then people think, why is he doing that? But you want to act natural and you know, be able to have at your ready reference all of the answers to, and it depends too on who the target is. Mm. If the target is very sophisticated, you need to work at it more. On the other hand, if the target really doesn't know the profession you're posing as at all, then it's probably, you let your other charm
get free balled a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So
do you think, have you ever had a case, or do you know other agents where they struggle to separate that once they get into a character? Like, are they able to switch from nuclear scientist to whoever it might be?
Well, okay, you can't pose as a scientist unless you are one. That'll last about 30 seconds.
Okay, that's a fair point.
I always would pose as something I know something about. I mean, I am an attorney. I grew up in Texas, so I know the oil and gas markets, and I took oil and gas law, and I ran a business for 4 years, so I can convincingly pose as a business person. But I wouldn't pose as somebody I didn't know much about. So that's what I'm saying. That I can fall back into a comfortable routine, and that's pretty wide latitude. Being an attorney, you can be an attorney about all kinds of things. So it just depends. One thing, we don't call ourselves agents. We're not CIA agents. We're CIA officers. Mm-hmm. The people we recruit are agents. So that's a terminology thing. It's unlike the FBI, where you have FBI agents. CIA employees are CIA officers. And I was an operations officer or a case officer. But people make that mistake quite often because it's the Central Intelligence Agency, they call us agents, but we're not. Mm-hmm. We'd make the distinction that the people we recruit, the foreign spies we recruit, those are agents. Those are our assets, the people that we recruit.
Wow, I didn't actually even know that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Well, it's just, that's the way it's been since we were formed in 1947. So, I mean, I can see why people call us agents, because it's the agency. And we refer to the agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
we are not agents. We recruit agents.
You guys are usually kind of making the operations work and tick and, setting up for...
Right. Rarely does a CIA officer, if he or she is the real spy, we recruit spies.
So let's jump into your background a little bit. I've seen, like I said, well, first off, an introduction, James Lawler, thank you for coming on the show today. Like I said, I saw you on Julian Dory's podcast. I thought you guys had a fantastic discussion. And like I said, I was really excited to speak to you on a plethora of items. So first off, thank you for coming on today. Continue with there. I'd love to jump into your background a little bit, both kind of the recruitment process, but really just, how you ended up coming in contact originally with the CIA. So can you maybe jump into, how you originally were going to go to law school and kind of what carried on from there?
Sure, absolutely, Reed. I was in my last year of law school, and I know you just finished graduate school a while back, and I'm sure the last semester of your graduate school was a lot like my last semester of law school. And you've got one thing on your mind, and that's, I've got to find a job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was interviewing with all kinds of law firms and thinking about, okay, I'm going to be a corporate attorney, or am I going to be a defense attorney? What am I going to do? And lo and behold, CIA came to campus. They put an announcement up, and they were interviewing for attorneys for the CIA's Office of General Counsel, the legal staff at CIA. Because like any large bureaucratic organization, be it government or private, CIA needs attorneys either to keep us out of trouble or get us out of trouble,
Mm-hmm.
which is sometimes something the CIA finds itself in trouble.
From time to time.
Sometimes. And so I went to this interview with this gentleman named Mr. Bill Wood, and he was there to find attorneys for our OGC, Office of General Counsel. Got about 2 minutes into the interview when Mr. Wood looked at me and he said, "Jim, have you ever thought about the clandestine service?" Now, this was 1976. There was not even a sign out on Dolly Madison Boulevard in McLean, Virginia, that said Central Intelligence Agency. Instead, the only sign out front of the CIA was a sign that said Federal Highway Administration. That little sign is still there, by the way.
Really?
And there really is a Federal Highway Administration building back there, outside of the gate. But I honestly didn't know what the clandestine service was. There was not much publicity. Sure, there was the movie 3 Days of the Condor, which was a entertainment for sure. Actually, it was one of my favorite films. But I knew nothing about it. And Mr. Wood said, "Well, Jim, I can't tell you much about it, but I think you'd be really good at this." So I was intrigued. I was thinking, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So I actually took the application, took it home, and then reality struck me that night when I finally thought about it, because my wife's mother, I'd been married a year, my wife's mother was very ill. Turns out terminally ill. The chances that we would move to Washington, D.C., away from Houston, Texas, and then thousands of miles overseas, that wasn't going to happen. So the next day, I physically returned the application and said the timing's not right. So instead of doing that, instead of going to work for the CIA in 1976, I went to work for a family business. Now, I don't know, Reed, if you've ever been in a family business.
I have.
Yeah, you have.
Mm-hmm.
I see the smile on your face, and I'm thinking, I bet you I know the reason why you're no longer in a family business. It's that F word, family.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you love your family like I do. I mean, I love my dad, my two brothers. And the bizarre thing was I was in a business, steel fabrication business, where I was making more money than I'd ever make the rest of my life. All kinds of benefits, a car, great medical benefits. I mean, I was even the boss. I was running the business. So it wasn't like I was micromanaged or anything like that. Making a lot of money. Absolutely miserable. Psychologically, I thought, there's got to be more to life than just making money. So for the next 3.5 years, I made a lot of money. I would come home, and frequently I would complain to my wife about how miserable I was. And she put up with it for a long time, and finally she was fed up. And she said, "Jim, either do something about it or stop your belly aching." So, excellent advice, because you really don't have a right to complain if you're not willing to do something about it. By that time, her mom had sadly passed away, so we no longer had the anchor of staying in Houston, Texas. So I went in my office, found Mr. Wood's card. I kept Bill Wood's card, wrote him a letter. I jokingly say that this was before Al Gore invented the internet. So I had to do a snail mail letter, explain to Mr. Wood that he had offered me an opportunity 3.5 years earlier. I couldn't take that opportunity then, but now I was ready. Mailed it. It was not 3 days later that I got a phone call, and a young woman said, "Mr. Wood received your letter. He will be out at the Holiday Inn on the Gulf Freeway next Thursday. Can you be in the lobby at 3 o'clock? She never used the initials CIA. That's all she said. And I said, yes, ma'am, I'm sure I can. This whole conversation probably lasted 45 seconds. So on that Thursday, I went out to the Holiday Inn. I met him in the lobby. He took me to his room, and for the next 2 hours, we chatted. And he said he'd like to fly me to Washington in a couple of weeks. And so I went for 3 days of interviews, testing, flew home. And then about 4 months later, I was invited to come back, this time for the polygraph, which is sometimes incorrectly known as a lie detector test, but it's a stress test. Mm-hmm. Then the shrink exam. Sometimes I wonder how I skated through that. And some other interviews. And the thing that clinched it for me was when a at that time, young operations officer decided he was talking to me and he invited me to come to the cafeteria and have a Coke. And so I went with him. And he said, Jim, let me tell you how much fun this business is. Every 2 weeks, I'm always surprised that they pay me to do this. That man was Ted Price. He ultimately rose to become head of the clandestine service. But at that time, he was a mid-level, GS-13, maybe 14. But a number of years later, about 20 years later, he was head of our clandestine service. And absolutely consummate case officer. But when he said that about how much fun it is, and the fact that being paid was irrelevant, I thought, damn, I want a job like that. Mm-hmm. And so I was convinced that's what I wanted. And literally about 4 or 5 weeks later, I got a phone call and they offered me a position as a GS-11. That's roughly equivalent to a first lieutenant in the military, operations officer. The bizarre thing was I had no idea what an operations officer does. Not at all. And I didn't care. I wanted to get away from Houston, Texas, away from the heat, the humidity, and the mosquitoes, and do something else. And my wife was very supportive. So in February of 1980, we moved to Washington, D.C., to McLean, Virginia. And I started work on February the 19th, 1980, not knowing what they wanted me to do and not caring. I would have taken a job on the planet Neptune. I didn't care. But then I found out, Reed, what a case officer does. And to be very blunt about it, they expected me to manipulate people, exploit people, subvert people, suborn people, convince people to betray their countries, to become traitors, to betray a trust. And I found out that not only was I pretty darn good at it, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. That's kind of the sociopathic part of being an operations officer in the CIA. I really enjoyed it, and I was good at it.
So I actually want to pull back a little bit. What do you think Mr. Woods saw in you initially?
That is a wonderful question, Reed. You're only the second or third person that's ever asked me that question. And I think it was the fact that he was an operations officer himself. And it's that old saying, if it takes one to know one. And I bet you he was a pretty good one to be able to recognize that I would have been a waste as an attorney working in the Office of General Counsel. But maybe it was my communication skills. Maybe he could see the sincerity and the passion that I had and my essential curiosity, because I was asking a lot of questions. And literally within 2 or 3 minutes, he totally disregarded his instructions of looking to hire an attorney, and instead he was going to hire an operations officer. Now, I don't know what the Office of General Counsel thought of that, because they were paying for him to hire attorneys. I think he was what we call an annuitant, meaning he was a retiree that was on contract and did these interviews. Another one of my CIA officer friends was also hired by Mr. Wood. So he was operating out of the Austin, San Antonio area of Texas, and Dallas as well, because my friend came from Dallas. But I guess they would just send him around interviewing prospective candidates, and he just disregarded his instructions and said Jim would be better being an operations officer. Now, the thing that was interesting was after I got out of training and was graduated from the farm, and we can talk about that if you want, but I was in a hardware store in McLean, Virginia here, not far from where I'm living, and a tall gentleman came up to me and said, "You may not remember me, but I was the last person who interviewed you a couple of years ago when you were going through the hiring process. And what you don't know is we were not going to hire you. But I asked you why you wanted to be a case officer, and you went into this very impassioned 10-minute soliloquy about how much it meant to you to serve our country, to be a case officer, and you just basically, you recruited me." He said, "I totally changed what we were going to do. We were not going to offer you a job." And he said, that's how I could tell you had the essentials to be a really top-notch case officer. And I didn't know that until 2 years later.
That's fascinating. I mean, the fact to run into him there too, and for him to kind of be open about that.
Right.
It's crazy. So let me ask that then. What are those essentials you think they're looking at in that testing and weeding out process? What's going on, everybody? Wanting to take a quick pause in the action and tell you guys about our brand new Patreon page. For only $3 a month, you guys will get exclusive access to Q&A sessions. That means questions coming directly from you will get asked for the guest and only exclusively released on Patreon. Also, with your subscription, you get access to the exclusive Patreon Discord. Overall, I can't stress enough how big your guys' support is for the continuation of the show. All the money made on this Patreon will be quickly reinvested to continue to get you guys the best guests and the best production value possible. So with that, if you're interested, please check out the link in the description. And with that, let's get back to the episode.
Well, it's interesting you asked, because I actually brought a piece of paper where I list, and I give this talk sometimes in courses, because I after I retired back in 2005, since then I've taught thousands of CIA, FBI, DIA, ops officers, special agents on what it means to be a recruiter, and what they were looking for in me was to be a recruiter. And I think the first quality of a top-notch recruiter is curiosity. I am a quintessentially curious person. Before we started taping this, you noticed I was asking you a lot of personal questions. I wasn't just doing that to be polite. I'm really interested. I'm curious why you became a podcaster, about your background, and things like that. That's just, some people would say I'm nosy, but I'm just curious. And that actually plays to everything I want to do, because a lot of people love to talk about themselves. People sometimes ask me about how much I had to defend my cover. Not much, because people really weren't interested in me. They were interested in themselves, which meant that was a convergence of interest, because I was interested in them too. Mm-hmm. So I'm a naturally curious person. I like to know what makes people tick. The second thing that a top-notch operations officer should have is a keen listening ability. You don't recruit people when you're talking. You recruit people when you're listening and allowing them to fill the silence. Now, I'm a slight extrovert. We have found out that the best ops officers are either slight extroverts or slight introverts. I have two brothers, and I love them dearly. They're poles apart, though, psychologically. My youngest brother is an extreme extrovert. He sucks the oxygen out of the room. He's quite good at being a absolutely superb real estate agent. I'm not so sure, however, how well he would do in my business, because sometimes he just can't shut up. My other brother is a polar opposite. He's a complete introvert. And he could have been seated here with us, Reed, and he wouldn't have said 3 words. Mm-hmm. And you can't be like that either. So in fact, Daniel Pink, the author, refers to people like me as an ambivert. I can go this way or I can go that way. So keen listening ability, just being able to shut up and listen to that person. And people find that very therapeutic. I had countless of the people I handled, my clandestine assets, my agents that I recruited, who found me to be like their therapist. They could tell me anything and they felt comfortable about it. Things they wouldn't even tell their spouse, their girlfriend, their boyfriend, but they would tell me. The third quality, I believe, is what I call extreme empathy. If I want to recruit you, Reed, I have to get inside your head and know what it's like to be you. I need to know what stresses you out, what pain you have, to take that on, understand that. And then that's how I find the path to recruitment. In all of my 25 years as an operations officer, I never once recruited a happy person. You recruit people who are under stress. Fourth quality is patience, something a lot of people don't have. One time, someone asked me what was the longest it took you to recruit a target. And I said, 11 years. I was focused on this person for 11 years. And in the first 10 and a half years, I didn't see the stress that I could address. But we were friends, literally friends. I'm not pretending to be the friend. I was literally his friend. And I was so close to him that he asked me several years into this relationship to be best man at his wedding. So we were close. I went off to another assignment, and ultimately he went off to another assignment. He comes from a country where his ethnic group had been the dominant group in the country for many, many years. But things change. History sometimes plays a part. And his ethnic group was replaced by another ethnic group. And so his ethnic group was no longer, shall we say, genetically advantaged in his structure. And about that same time, his marriage fell apart. The young lady that he married, she went overseas with him, thousands of miles from her home, and she was very unhappy and decided, I didn't sign on to be 10,000 miles from home. So she decided to get a divorce and took their newborn child home with her to her home country. So his marriage has fallen apart. He gets reassigned to his home country for the first time in almost 11 years, 10 years. He gets there and he starts working. He's a very hard worker. He's very smart. And one day I get a note from him that says, Jim, I realized that I could work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and because I'm not in the privileged class, I can no longer be promoted ever again. How can I give allegiance to a country which treats its citizens like that? Which in essence, Reed is saying, recruit me. So I asked him, I knew that he was going to the home country of his ex-wife to celebrate their child's 3rd birthday. So I said, I've got a business trip going through that country, close to that country. Why don't you and I talk about job opportunities? He said, that sounds great. That took me about 30 seconds to what we call drop cover, apologize for pretending to be a State Department officer, but instead thanking him for, even if he realized I was not truly a State Department officer, not to jeopardize my security. And I said, I'm with the CIA, and I'd like you to be on my team. And he said, Jim, you've now given me something to believe in. And so he went on to work for us for a number of years. And in fact, people sometimes wonder, how could you betray your country? Well, the way I think they rationalize it is that they were betrayed first. Here he was betrayed. His country decided not to treat him like a citizen anymore. And so he told me that when 9/11 happened, he was at his ministry, his foreign ministry, and he noticed when those towers were coming down in New York, he got very emotional. I mean, he was basically weeping. And his colleagues saw that and they wondered, why in the world are you so upset? You're not an American. Why are you upset? And he said, what they didn't know is I'm on your team now. And they switched allegiance. My job was basically to convince people, come over to my team, and that way they have no more loyalty to the old team. He was also, like I said, going through a very tumultuous time in his life with that divorce. Within a short period of time in my career, I recruited at least 3 people going through nasty divorces. In fact, headquarters nicknamed me Dr. Divorce. It's probably the most psychologically troubling, financially troubling, disruptive time of anybody's life. And if I'm in your orbit and I know that you have access to information I need, I'll become your friend. I'll be like a life ring for you. So I'm looking for people under stress, and that's a lot of stress. Fifth quality of a top-notch recruiter is persistence and a laser-like focus. At times, I violated that quality by being not as persistent as I should have been. I was looking at in fact, not just looking, I was meeting with an official of an Eastern Bloc country back when the Soviet Union and the East Bloc still existed. And people could see the handwriting on the wall that things were falling apart. So I pitched this guy. He was an intelligence officer from an Eastern country. And he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes either. In fact, he told me an interesting story about how his father, who had been a communist, told him, I went to bed last night as a communist and I woke up and I'm no longer a communist. So he's kind of telling me that he's interested. But my big mistake, Reed, was I didn't persist and pitch him again and say, come on over to my side. Instead, I was focused on the fact that my family and I were leaving that country in another week or so, and I was impatient and I didn't persist. So honing in on the guy, I could have gotten him. Sixth quality is creativity. We can always use more creativity. Being flexible, coming up with a solution to a problem. Seventh one, and this is very important, being a careful observer of stressors in people's lives. I seem to have had a talent for recognizing stress in people's lives and then being able to address the stress and relieve it. The eighth quality is sometimes misconstrued because it's such a harsh word, and that word is ruthlessness. Sounds very harsh. But by that word, I mean never forgetting why you're doing what you're doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing. If I start taking you out for a lot of dinners and we're having fun together, that's all good. But don't get into the mindset that I'm just doing this to be your friend. If that's all it is, let's call it a friendship. But knowing that at some point I've got to pitch you to commit espionage. And a mediocre to poor case officer will fear rejection. And it's harsh. I don't know if, Reed, you're a good-looking guy, but have you ever asked a girl out and she turned you down?
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's hard, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But I bet you kept asking girls. Right. You didn't just give up. You just didn't give up on girls, did you? No. So I tell all of my students, I said, if you've never had a pitch rejected, you haven't pitched enough people. You need to constantly be out there and pitching. And of course, the poor case officer won't do that because they fear the rejection and they fear they might insult the person. Well, that's the risk you take. You know, I jokingly say that our initials, CIA, that doesn't stand for Central Insurance Agency. We're risk takers. So always probing the limits and stuff. The next quality is having a powerful or persuasive personality. Being able to get people to say, I want to be part of Jim's team. I like him. Now, how do you make yourself likable? I think you either have that or you don't. But, being a good listener, being a careful observer of stress, being available for people, knowing that the friendship or the trust is, and by the way, trust is the essential quality of this, because if I recruit someone, they're putting not only their career, but sometimes their life in my hands, and they know that. The Russians have an expression. We asked a former KGB psychologist, what does it take for us to recruit someone like you? And the guy said in Russian, he says, well, first, you have to be серьезный человек, a serious person. You have to be serious because I'm putting my life in your hands. Otherwise, I'm going to get a bullet in the back of my head in the Lubyanka. And then finally, the quality that is the most mysterious of all is what I call the metaphysics, mastering the metaphysics. And that's a kind of a spooky thing that only maybe 1 or 2% of ops officers have. And by what I mean is it's some kind of neural link that a top-notch case officer makes with a target. In essence, when I go into my pitch, you and I are no longer part of this. We could have fires, explosions going off, and neither one of us would be aware of it because I've already made a mental link into your brain. And I'm imagining that. Whether it really happens or not, I don't know. But it gives me the extra confidence, and confidence is everything when you go into a pitch, knowing that there's a 99.99% chance that you are going to now work with me or for me. And so being that self-assured, and then that person just wants to kind of surrender and let you be the driver in the train.
So with those qualities, to find a person that has the ability to meet with, hide in the shadows, be able to recruit someone to, as you highlighted, do the biggest possible thing they can do, and that is to betray their country and come to your team. Can you train for that?
To an extent. A dear friend of mine who was an operational psychologist at CIA, he was part of the recruitment program for CIA officers, and his rule of thumb was selection beats training every time. If I talk to you and I think Reed's actually got it, it won't take much training to get him up to where we need him to be. But we can take someone who doesn't have that and we can bring them up to an okay level. But to get up to be the top class, you're either born with that or you're not. Probably by the time you're in your 20s or even earlier, we know that you've got the interpersonal skills, the communication skills, the trustworthiness. Again, trust is everything, the trustworthiness. That, it's charisma, it's caring about people, it's being sensitive. I use that word empathic. The interesting thing is we often picture CIA officers as James Bond type characters. I gave a talk about what it's like to be a CIA officer to a high school class, a bunch of seniors at a local high school. And all the guys were bored out of their minds because I wasn't talking about my Aston Martin and about my secret weapons and all the things that I was used. The women, on the other hand, were fascinated, absolutely fascinated, because women, frequently by their very nature, are very touchy-feely, like I am. And having that sensitivity and sensibility, they were fascinated. After my talk, I must have had a dozen of these gals up there wanting to know how they could join the CIA.
Really?
And not a single male. Not a single male. And so sometimes I wonder if it's my feminine nature that's coming apart, across to people, or what it is. But women make wonderful case officers, wonderful operations officers. One of my best students, somebody you should have on your show sometimes, is a DIA case officer named Shawnee Delaney. Shawnee took one of my courses in about the year 2007 or 2008. She has now taken all of my training courses, and out of thousands of students I've taught, she's the best one. She's got it. She knows how to work everything. She's got the metaphysics, but she's a great public speaker now. She has her own business, and she's a real expert on insider threat, meaning someone, basically the type of person like I am, who recruits an insider to betray the company or the country. People talk about all of their cyber defenses and things like that. Well, that's well and good. But it doesn't matter if you have top-notch cyber defenses if I've got somebody on the inside. That's like saying that you've got a castle and your moat is so wide. It doesn't matter if I get somebody to lower the drawbridge. Mm-hmm. So she's an expert. Shawnee Delaney, if you ever get a chance to have her on your program, she's extremely effective, one of my best friends, and top-notch. She was with DIA for about 10 years now. She's been running insider threat for some major pharmaceutical companies. She ran it for Uber. And you think, well, she was driving a cab? No, she wasn't driving a cab. Uber has a lot of proprietary intellectual property, all of those algorithms that makes uber possible. They are magic in a sense. You want an Uber? Well, that's very sensitive proprietary technology. So she was in charge of their worldwide program of protecting that intellectual property. So it has an application not just against government targets, but also against corporate targets. Corporations have their own version of classified information. It's intellectual property. It's their research and development. It's their customer lists. It's their pricing. It's their supplier list. All of these things are very sensitive. And if you have somebody who's bad on the inside of a company that sells that out to somebody else, it could cost you not just millions, but billions of dollars.
No, she sounds fascinating. I definitely will, after the show, discuss getting her on because I would love to have her on. And with that, too, I'm kind of curious. Has the CIA ever run tests or studies on seeing kind of the family dynamics of people that make these type of agents?
Funny you ask that. We actually have. And I'm actually including a huge portion of that very subject in my new novel, which is called The Traitor's Tale. And we found out that a disproportionate number of people who ended up working for us had a dysfunctional relationship with either their father or mother. And you can look and see a lot of the American spies who've become traitors. They've had dysfunctional relationships, typically with a father, although it could be a mother. Even Kim Philby, I don't know if your listeners know who Kim Philby was. But
could you explain just in case?
Sure. Back in the 1930s, there were 5 British students at Cambridge, ultimately referred to as the Cambridge Five, who were recruited by Soviet intelligence. Back then, it was not the KGB, but it was NKVD, which became the KGB. I think all 5 of the Cambridge Five were recruited by the same NKVD officer. There was a guy named John Cairncross. There was Anthony Blount. There was Donald McLean, Guy Burgess. But the most notorious one was Harold Kim Philby. Kim Philby became head of station in Washington, D.C., head of the British MI6 station. MI6 is British equivalent to CIA. He was recruited along with his 4 Cambridge Five colleagues by the Soviets before they were actually in MI6 or MI5. So it was what we call a seeding operation. I'm going to take someone who's extremely talented, who would make a great MI6 officer or CIA officer, recruit them, and then feed them into that organization to where they're already recruited. I don't have to go and recruit them. They're already one of ours. And that's what the Cambridge Five was. Kim Philby entered MI6. During the war, after the war, he rose up in the ranks. He almost became head of MI6. Yes, he was that good.
Head of MI6. Oh
yes. Now, the intelligence that he and the others gave to Moscow was so good that Soviet counterintelligence thought this can't be right. This is too good to be true. You know that old saying, if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. But it was. And they were recruited mostly on an ideological basis. Back in the 30s, it was fashionable for young people and college students to be Marxists. It was a fashionable ideology, very noble. Philby and the others, though, they all had other reasons why they did this. And one of Philby's reasons, I think, was he had a very dysfunctional relationship with his father. His father was a man named St. John Philby. He was an Arabist scholar. He converted to Islam. He was overseas a lot. He was gone all the time. Very famous. I think Kim Philby didn't have a father to look up to, and in a sense, psychologically, Joseph Stalin and the Communist Party of Moscow, basically the Soviet Communist Party, replaced his father as the paternal figure he needed. And we've found that dysfunctional relationship with a parent is often a root cause for why people ultimately became a spy. Now, in my own experience, I always say that there are multiple reasons why people do this, become a spy, to commit espionage. I call it a whole mosaic of reasons. My first big recruitment operation when I was overseas, I got a secret cable from Washington, telling us that a year from that date, that the United States was going to enter into a series of high-level, high-stakes negotiations with a certain foreign country. And sadly, we had no sources that could tell us what the other country's negotiating positions were. It always is in our interest to get a peek at their cards and see, okay, what are their negotiating strategies? We had nobody. But I had fortunately, accidentally, just met someone from that country who had every bit of the access that we needed, every bit. So I started the developmental process. That's where you start trying to become that person's friend. You build that essential element of trust, and you get it to where you can say to them, figure out what makes them tick and how to structure a recruitment pitch to appeal to them to get them to become a spy for you. Well, this was my first tour, and I'm a very naive first tour officer. And I decided that I could recruit this man just because he and I were such good buddies. Basically, so naive, I thought I could recruit someone on the force of my personality alone. I didn't know a single stress in this guy's life. So I wrote this stupid cable back to headquarters justifying why I was going to do this. And headquarters was as stupid as I was, and they approved it. By the way, you can't just go and pitch somebody.
I was about to ask
No,
that.
you can't just pitch somebody. You've got to get headquarters approval, not only for the fact that you're going to pitch them to become a spy, but secondly, whatever the financial compensation package is, X number of dollars a month, be it $1,000, $2,000, whatever, that you're going to propose, they've got to approve that. You can't just go and say, hey, Reed, how about $1 million a month? No, you got to say, okay, we're going to do it for this amount. I think I can recruit him for this amount of money a month, which we term a consulting fee. But no, it's a bribe.
Mm-hmm.
Of course it is. Well, anyhow, I got a cable from headquarters saying they approved my stupid recruitment strategy. And it was stupid. So I take this guy to dinner, and I pitched him, and I'm sure it was awkward, but I got the point across that if he shared these sensitive positions with me, that in return, I could offer him a consulting fee of so much a month. He looked at me and he said, Jim, you and I are friends, but that would be morally wrong. Reed, I've pitched 50 or 60 people in my career. He's the only person that ever pitched or ever posed a moral objection. The only person. Normally, if they reject your pitch, it's because of what? Take a guess.
They don't want to get shot.
Right, fear. I had one African intelligence officer say, Jim, in my country, they hang people for doing things like that. And he's right, they would.
Yeah.
No, it's fear. They'll turn you down for fear. And well, of course, that guy, if I can digress here just a moment, he said, but could I have a rain check? The African intelligence officer. I said, a rain check? What do you mean? He said, well, I've got a 3-year-old son, and I don't need you now, but in 15 years, he's going to be college age. I might need you then. I wrote that down. 15 years later, he was posted to Washington, D.C., and Africa Division asked me if he meant what he said. And I said, yep, sure enough. We cashed in that rain check 15 years later. But back to my story. I've now been rejected by this. This is my first big recruitment pitch. And by the way, in a CIA officer's career, your first tour can make or break you. And up until then, I'd been in this country for a year where I was assigned. I had not recruited anybody. I mean, I was a total failure. So here I've just pitched my first major target and been turned down. We have a saying in the Directorate of Operations at the CIA that it's okay to be turned down, but not turned in. If he goes to his ambassador and says, Mr. James Lawler, third secretary of the embassy, just propositioned me to become a traitor. I could just imagine his ambassador storming into our ambassador's office, pounding the table, and saying, this is outrageous. Mr. Lawler just pitched my employee. In fact, the guy I just pitched was his deputy, the number 2 guy in the embassy. So he was a senior officer. So you can imagine this man's outrage that I was so brazen as to proposition his deputy to become a spy, to be a traitor. So I'm going through this mental anguish. And about 3 days after I had this disastrous dinner, I called him up to just see if we're still friends or not. That's all I wanted to know. So I talked to him and I said, well, we had such a good time the other night. I was just wondering if this Friday we could go out again, have dinner again. My only purpose is to see if this guy and I are still friends, and maybe to backpedal if he's been insulted. Somehow explain to him that I was mistaken, I'm so sorry, my words were taken out of context, smooth things out. Well, I was relieved that he didn't hang up in my ear that when I called him. And then secondly, when I said about going out again, he said, Jim, I was thinking the same thing. That would be fun. So I'm like, whew. So I go to this second dinner 1 week after the first. And my only purpose is smooth, turbulent waters. Let's make sure that he's not turned me in and complained to somebody. So imagine my astonishment when about a minute after the waiter has come over, dropped the menus off, and left, my friend's first words, Jim, that offer you made me last week, is that still good? I went, of course it is. I made it because we're friends. And he said, well, what you don't know is that 2 days after that dinner, my wife announced that she wants a divorce, and I can't afford to pay her the alimony to which she's entitled, and put my 2 high school-age boys in private schools when we go home next summer. Because in my country, you can't get a good education unless you're in a private school. I can't do that unless I take your offer. And I know it's morally wrong, but I don't have a choice. So one of the things they teach you in law school is if the judge rules in your favor, shut up and get out of court quickly. So I accepted his offer. And then I found out it wasn't simply the psychological, financial, emotional turmoil of the divorce and the devotion that he had to his children, which were all there. But as he handed me a stack several inches thick of classified materials, he said, let me tell you something about my boss and how much I hate him. He steals credit for everything I do and everything everybody else in the embassy does. And he goes around this country like a little banty rooster, claiming credit for everything we do. And as I hand you this material, this classified material, it's as if I'm kicking that son of a bitch in the face. And I took it from him and I said, we're on the same team. Get some more of this and let's kick that son of a bitch again. He was great. And then we, so basically, revenge. He was evening the score. The Jesuits have an expression called covert compensation. And so he was compensating for the fact that his boss was treating him like dirt. He also told me, whether it's true or not, but it was his perception, that because he was fairly light-complected, blonde, blue-eyed, in a country where most of the natives are darker skin, mixed race, and brown eyes and not blue eyes, that he was the target or the victim of reverse discrimination. Maybe that's retroactive justification, I don't know. But his most important or surprising motive was revealed on his counterintelligence polygraph exam. We were going to polygraph him, put him through this stress test, some people call it a lie detector test, for a very important reason. That's because he was going to go back to his country, like I said, in a year, and he was going to be handled by one of my colleagues who does not have diplomatic protection. We call this a non-official cover officer, a NOC officer. They operate under business cover or some other cover. They're not connected to the embassy. They have no diplomatic protection. They're at the pointy end of the spear. If they are arrested, they don't get out of jail. They're toast. So to make sure that the man I just recruited was legitimate, really working for us, and would not jeopardize my colleague, who was a NOC officer in this man's home country, we were going to put him through a very, very strict counterintelligence polygraph, which basically, in this case, would have 3 very black or white questions. And you go over these questions with the polygraph operator before you have the test. The questions would be things like, have you told anyone about your secret relationship with CIA? That's pretty easy, yes or no. Number 2, are you working with any intelligence organization other than CIA? Again, pretty simple. And number 3, did anyone direct you to volunteer to Mr. Lawler at that last dinner? Very easy. Those are the questions that the polygraph operator is supposed to ask, and he's not supposed to stray from those questions unless the person he's testing gives him license to do so, make some comment. But, as luck would have it, I had a young polygraph operator who'd never tested anybody overseas before, probably had not met very many foreigners. And the first words out of this young man's mouth to my friend were, "Golly gee, I'm just wondering why you're doing this." And I was just horror-stricken, thinking, oh my God, he's going to have a moral epiphany. He's going to stalk out of here, come to his senses, and I will again have my career down the toilet. You know, my friend started laughing, and he said, I'm doing this because I think it's going to be a lot of fun. He was a thrill seeker. And boy, did he have a lot of fun, and did we have a lot of fun. He went back inside his country a year later, and not only could he tell us what their negotiating positions were, he could tell us exactly what their fallback positions were. Meaning, the last time you bought a car or a house or a condo, how would you like to know the absolute bottom dollar that you could offer the seller before they walk away? And that's what he told us. And it was estimated that in this very high-stakes national securities negotiation, he saved our government not millions, but tens of billions of dollars because he told us exactly what those fallback positions were.
So let me ask this. When you guys are getting information like that and, you know, like you're saying, you're getting tons of classified information, you understand all the dynamics that they can bring to the negotiation table. How do we handle that on our end in terms of not, obviously, if you go right to the bottom dollar, they're going to say, how did they
That's an excellent question, Reed. I was handling another source, sensitive source. And yeah, you're right, because the consumer of that intelligence is not necessarily an intelligence officer. We're all sworn to protect our sources. And a person who's not an intelligence officer, they don't mean harm, but they're not as careful how they use that information, which is exactly what you're saying. You know, how do they use the information? You're right. If they went exactly to the bottom dollar, they're going to smell a rat. So I had a similar situation where I'd collected some very interesting information on a target, and the target let me know that he let me know that the head of their delegation, who was in touch with one of our senior diplomats, that the head of the delegation was looking around for another job. Now, if you're very senior in an organization and you're looking around for another job, there's usually only 2 or 3 people maybe that know you're doing that. Very circumscribed audience, you know, because you don't want your colleagues thinking, well, Reed's looking around for another job. You know, you just you know, it's very close held. Maybe your lover, your best friend. Well, anyways, my guy that I'd recruited told me that the head of their delegation was looking around for another job, and he was one of maybe 3 people that knew that. So I included it in an intelligence report because I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, it's something our head of our delegation should know. But the head of our delegation was such a moron, he actually said something to the guy about, oh, so looking around for another job, are you? Headquarters and I both just about had heart attacks. Fortunately, I guess there were enough people, 3 or 4 people, that he couldn't pin down who the leak was. But you're right. It's happened where sometimes a senior American official would say something stupid and implicate, you know, who the spy is.
Yeah, it's a horrible way to burn an asset.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have a group of people. I'm an operations officer, but we had another group of people who we call collection management officers, and they're the ones that structure the intelligence to where hopefully it won't point big neon arrow at whoever the source is. And that's their job, to structure the intelligence report to where they can fuzz up where it was collected. Because, if I say I collected it in Berlin and there was only so many people that I could have, but, so they'll fuzz up the place acquired, the date. They may fuzz up some other things so that the intelligence, the value is still there, but we're protecting the source, which is our absolute number one commitment: protect the source.
So let me ask this. You highlighted about the original officer or recruitment there, where you said that he had a moral issue with wanting to join, and then by the end you find out he's thrill-seeking. This is fun. Did any of the recruitments or assets that you were able to get, did they ever surprise you in terms of, you'll build for years with some of these individuals, really getting to know them, and then they may go from morally objecting to becoming a thrill seeker and, fully on the team? Some
of them, yeah. Well, the more comfortable they get with the clandestine life. I know I handled a person, by handling meaning I didn't recruit the person, but he had been recruited 10 or 15 years earlier. And yet I inherited the handling of this person. I would meet with him and he would hand me very classified information. But I looked into the origin of the relationship, when the relationship started. And he was originally recruited on the basis of giving us some information that had nothing to do with his own government, but had everything to do with some people he was in touch with, not from his country. They could have been Chinese or Russians or somebody like that. So it's, you could see where if somebody's asking you not to betray your country, but to give us some information about another third country, Russians, Chinese, you'd find that no moral objection to that. And if I get paid for it, what the better. Well, that lasted, and he even made a point. He says, but I'll never tell you anything about what my country's doing. Well, by the time I handled him 10 or 15 years, inherited him 10 or 15 years later, that was out the window. He was giving me everything. I mean, everything. All of their negotiating positions, all of their most sensitive information. So he had gotten used to the money, he'd gotten used to the relationship. Maybe other things happened in his life that caused him to be disaffected from his country. But he got comfortable with it. It's kind of like, I'm sure you've seen that series Breaking Bad, where, you're kind of here and then you're on that slippery slope. Yep. And you're just going down. And pretty soon, man, yeah, you want amphetamines? I've got amphetamines.
You're making the best meth for the cartels.
Exactly. Yeah. You start off with a noble thing. Well, sometimes people do that.
So let me ask, I guess since we were discussing a lot of the pitching and evaluation process, can you kind of go through some of the key aspects? So maybe when you first get an eye on a target, what that evaluation would look like, what possible timelines might look like, and then what the actual pitch?
It's hard to predict the timeline. As you get more used to doing this, as I got more experienced, I got better at it, of course. It looks like anything else. If you practice, I know you're a lacrosse player. I'm sure you were much better in your fifth or sixth year than you were in your first year. Mm-hmm. And you get good. You can read the field, I bet, better, the whole field. It's not just the person you're playing, but read the field. The ins and the outs. And it's the same thing with what I do. The thing that I enjoyed about the career was people are like snowflakes. They're all different. And so it never was boring. In fact, we jokingly say that case officers, ops officers, are basically ADHD. We get bored easily. But being a CIA officer, I was never bored. People are all different. My ability to read them, I got better at it. I got to the point where I'd say at least 90% of the time I was successful. Now, somebody asked me if I would pitch somebody who I knew would say no, and I said, why would I do that? Although I have, at times it didn't cost anything. At the end of the Cold War, for example, we knew that all the Eastern European countries were no longer going to be communist. And so we were pretty much freed to not cold pitch somebody, and I'll explain a cold pitch in a moment, but not cold pitch somebody necessarily, but it wouldn't cost anything to pitch them. So what if they turn us down? As long as you're not posted to that country. Clearly, I'm not going to pitch an East German inside of East Germany. But if the person is posted where you are in a more benign environment, what does it matter? And so, I did pitch some people that ultimately reported the pitch. And actually, they probably regretted reporting it because 6 months later, the Communist Party was out. But the ability to read someone, to kind of know what, it's a dance sometimes. I would pose questions. We'd have lunch or dinner, and I'd say, Reed, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Or if you could do something different in your life, what would you do? And people like that kind of conversation. They would say, well, I would do this differently, or they might start letting on that they don't like their boss, or they've got limited career possibilities, things that I know or their marriage is in trouble, or they've got tensions going on. And so, again, people like to confide in me. I had one asset once tell me, Jim, when you're talking to me, it's like my brain is in a warm waterbed. I want them relaxed and able to share all kinds of things. But I couldn't read everybody 100%. I was up to 90%. That's what makes it fun. I mean, if it was 100%, it wouldn't be fun anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I knew every time I pitched somebody, they were mine, what's the challenge in that? Mm-hmm. It'd be like if you were just constantly winning all your lacrosse games and the other team was terrible.
You get bored quick.
Get bored pretty quickly. So there has to be some challenge to it.
Mm-hmm. So what are you game planning when you go into a pitch? Obviously it's different for each individual, but what are some of kind of the initial thoughts?
Well, sometimes I'll do a hypothetical. I'll mention something maybe true, maybe imaginary in my own life, that a challenge. And in fact, we have what I call a reverse pitch, where I will say a couple of friends of mine, one had access to some good information, the other guy knew that he had a market for that information, and that together as a team, they could make so much money doing this. And I've had more than one of my targets say, well, Jim, you and I could do that. And I'd say, well, tell me how we could do that. So basically the person pitches themselves. It's what I call a reverse pitch. They say, well, you and I could do this, and here's how we would do it. I say, well, you really want to do it?
Like that idea?
Yeah. And get them to basically think it's their proposal, which, makes them feel like they're in charge. And I want them to be on my team.
So what personality do you think is the most difficult for a pitch?
I teach a lot of courses on how to recruit scientists. And the thing is, scientists think differently than people like you and me who are liberal arts majors. I know you were a political science major like I was. We think differently from, say, a chemist or a physicist or a mathematician or, physicist. And so not filling the silence, letting them talk, going up against a really introverted person or even a borderline autistic person can be difficult. You have to be very patient with that person. And again, you're building the trust. And that can be difficult with somebody who is, like I said, either borderline or high-functioning autistic, which a lot of scientists are, but also somebody who's very introverted. On the other hand, you can turn that around, and where they really trust you. They're so introverted and they see you as a protector, and they want to let you, to a certain extent, be in charge. So being able to read the personality is good. And then structuring the pitch, again, I might start with a hypothetical, or I might do what I call a test balloon, a little thing, we call that showing a little thigh, to get the person intrigued to where it's not a total surprise when I finally pitch the person. In fact, the pitch could go over several meetings. It doesn't mean, this one meeting, it's right here, sign on the line and be my spy. It may be several meetings, I've talked to some people back home. Your information is very interesting. I had one target that I took to lunch, And he told me some interesting things, but they weren't classified, but they were interesting. Some dynamics in his ministry at home. Probably shouldn't have been saying them, but if you asked me, were they secret or top secret? No, not really. It was some of the backbiting, some of the infighting in the senior levels of his ministry, things that he didn't like. He might not have liked these people, so he didn't have any problem with talking about it. In fact, he probably wanted to get it off his chest. But at the very next meeting, I came to him and I said, you wouldn't believe what happened to me this morning. I walked in and I found out, because I had taken the liberty, and I'm sorry if I made a mistake doing this, but I sent to Washington in a very top secret channel some of the things you told me a week ago at lunch. And they came back and they've given me a $2,000 Exceptional Performance Award. But I can't take that. I mean, I have to at least share it with you. Otherwise, I'm stealing your thoughts. And I'd have $1,000 in an envelope and I'd slip it over across the table under a menu. And 9 times out of 10 or more, they'd first say, no, I don't need that. And I'd say, look, we're a team. That was, I made $1,000. Now you've made $1,000. They take it.
That's genius. It's setting the stage right there. So let me ask this then. Do you feel like, and you may not be able to answer this specifically, but how often do you think assets have at least a minimal idea that you may not necessarily be who you are or who you say you are?
Well, most of the time. Okay, we have different types of pitches. We have one pitch where I recruit somebody on a commercial basis. I'm posing as a business person, and even if you're a government official, you have information that could be of high interest to me. That happened also on my first tour. I was handling an asset, again, an agent, a spy, who had been in his foreign ministry and had been a good asset, but the regime changed in his country very radically. And he, after a year or two, he was a mid-level diplomat. He was not at the top. He was not an ambassador or anything like that, but he was mid-level. But after a while, they basically forced him to retire. He was part of the old regime and not part of this new, more extreme regime. So he's retired, and you think, well, what good can a retired person be? No longer has a clearance, no longer has the access. But he was a very charismatic person and very popular in his foreign ministry. People liked him, regardless of the fact that he had to retire. He had a colleague, one of his best friends, who was living just a few doors away from him in this foreign city. And this colleague and other people, the people from the home country, would fly into this city. And because my friend was so popular, he would take them out to lunch and dinner and things. And they would talk gossip, what's going on back home. And then my friend would write this stuff up, and then I would submit it to Washington as intelligence. And it was good. It was good. But like I said, he was neighbors with another guy from the same country who had been in his foreign ministry. And this friend of his had a younger sister, much younger, maybe 20 years younger, who also was with the foreign ministry. And she decided to take a 3-month sabbatical and stay with her older brother in I'll just say it was a very mountainous country in Europe, and spend the summer, in the mountains. I mean, what a great thing. So she took a leave without pay. She just, not quitting, but she just wants to take this leave and be with her big brother. Well, her big brother's best friend, who's my agent, my asset, decides that he'll take her around for lunches and dinners and sightseeing and shows her the stuff. Of course, we're paying for all this, but she was a little chatterbox and would tell him all kinds of things that were going on at senior levels of their foreign ministry. And I was submitting these reports to Washington, getting very good evaluations on them. And I even commended him for what great reporting we were getting because of him working this young woman. And he said, Jack, which was the alias I was using, Jack, she doesn't hate Americans. She's not like a lot of people that are in my country these days. She actually likes Americans. You could recruit her. I'm thinking, whoa, how do I do that? I'm a first tour officer, very naive. I was perfectly content to get the stuff filtered through him. Mm-hmm. But he's wiser and older, and he says, you could meet her and get it directly. But my first commitment to any person I work with is always their security. And so, Reed, if I pitch this young woman, and she rejects the pitch. And if he introduces her to me, she knows that he's probably working for me, which I can't allow. So I had to work out a scheme where he was going to take her to a certain restaurant in this city they lived in, and I was going to show up about 15 minutes later. And then he was going to say, oh, look, there's Mr. Jack Mitchell. I just met him at a cocktail party last Wednesday. Excuse me, let me go speak to him. So he comes over, reminds me who he is. Oh yeah, right, I remember now at the Anderson's cocktail party or whatever. And he goes and he sits back down. So I'm still standing up there waiting for a dining companion to show up, imaginary dining companion. So I'm standing up there, and after about 5 more minutes, my friend turns to this young lady and says, let's ask Mr. Mitchell to join us for drinks until his friend shows up. So he comes over there, and of course I said, no, I don't want to be a third wheel at this party. He said, oh, come on, Mr. Mitchell, just join us just for drinks until your friend shows up. So I kind of let myself be dragged over there. And of course, I, quote unquote, hardly know the guy. So he introduces me to this young woman, and I decided, because the relations between our two countries was so bad, that I could not say I was from the U.S. Embassy. Instead, because her country has a fortune in oil and gas, I said that I was an oil and gas commodities trader. And from Texas, I know a little bit about the oil and gas markets. So when he introduces, and I discover that she's from this other country, which is a member of OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, I said, could we have lunch? And she said, of course. So I got permission to pitch her on a commercial basis for giving me insights into what her country was going to do in the oil and gas markets. And her country has substantial enough oil and gas reserves to where whatever they do has a disproportionate amount of influence on those markets. So it made total sense that if I was really an oil and gas commodities trader, I could make a fortune, a lot of money, having advance information, insider trading in essence, on what that country was going to be doing. Now, I also knew something else about her, though, and that was my friend had told me that she needed to have a medical procedure performed within the next 2 or 3 weeks that was going to cost her $5,000 roughly. And her ministry at home said, we're not going to pay for it unless you come home, because you're not assigned to that country. You're assigned back here in the capital. Well, she knew if she flew home and had it done, she probably wouldn't get permission to come back. So she had a quandary. She needed $5,000 for a procedure that was basically an overnight procedure, but she needed to have it done. Well, I proposed that we have a commercial consulting relationship. She gives me insights on oil and gas, and guess what? I'm going to pay her so many $1,000 a month plus a $5,000 signing bonus, meaning she can stay, and she gets to be a consultant with Jack Mitchell. And we celebrated with champagne. She gave me some information that I needed about the oil and gas market. And I went back to my office, a very happy camper, a very significant recruitment, and already some intelligence that I could put out. And that's when my boss dropped the dime on me, and he said, Jim, now you've got to go back down and tell her that you're really CIA. You have to drop cover. And I said, why would I do that? And he said, well, number one, we're interested in a lot more than just the oil and gas policies of this country. Number two, she needs to know for her own security that this is just not a casual consulting relationship, because if she brags about it to a bunch of her friends, her security people might get curious about who is her American consultant benefactor, Number three, we no longer have an embassy in her country because relations are so hostile. So the only way we're going to be able to communicate is through some kind of covert communication system, which means we'd have to issue that, and that looks very weird for a consultant. And number four, she's going to have a polygraph before she gets that equipment, gets the covert communications method. So you need to go tell her you're really CIA. And I thought, oh God, this is not going to go well. Because I had not, like a lot of first tour officers, I hadn't thought about the next move. I hadn't thought of any of those moves. So I went down and I broke cover. I apologized, told her I was really a CIA officer. And I tell you, Reed, the look of fear on her face I mean, she looked literally like Bambi in the headlights. And she said, Jack, look, I like you, but I can't do that. I mean, consulting, it's on the edge, but what you're asking me to do is to become a spy. I can't be a spy. They'll kill me. They'll send me to prison. They'll torture me. They'll hang me, which is true. They would. And so she said, look, I'll try and get you your money back, the signing bonus, but I can't do this. And I thought, woman, you're pretty smart. So I go back and I tell my boss, well, about like I expected, she's quit. He said, Jim, the chief of our division, the chief of station, the chief of the division where her country's located, all are celebrating that you scored the first major recruitment of a person from her ministry in months, maybe a year, and you're going to take it off the scoreboard? You go down and recruit her. Listen to me. Go recruit her. Nothing like a little pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got to go recruit this woman, somehow convince her to change her mind and become a spy for the CIA. And I did not have a clue what to do. So I went to a phone booth and I called her and said, I know you're leaving in a couple of weeks, but I thought maybe we'd have a farewell dinner. And she was not really mad at me, but I remember she was kind of, okay, sure. All right, sure. So I thought I've got 3 days to come up with some very convincing argument to have her change her mind and become a spy for the CIA. Well, for the next 3 days, Reed, I couldn't think of anything. I got in a train. I went the 3 hours to her city where she was. And the whole time I'm thinking, now, how do I convince her? And I couldn't come up with any idea. As I was marching through the train station, I thought the decent thing to do would be to buy her a little going-away gift. And so I went into this gift shop in the station, and I saw a very delicate vase for rosebuds or flowers, maybe 6 inches tall. I remember it was very delicate Chinese, kind of a Mari type bud vase. It cost me maybe $50. I had it gift wrapped, and I took it to the hotel, and then ultimately I went off to the restaurant where I was going to have dinner with her. Now, this restaurant, absolutely one of the most gorgeous restaurants in all of Europe. It's surrounded by mountain lakes, mountains. It has a fabulous atmosphere, fabulous cuisine and service, exquisite wine list, low lighting, very romantic. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about her. She comes from a country where the women are amazingly beautiful. I have an expression, drop dead beautiful. They have fabulous complexion, olive skin, gorgeous eyes that look like pools of water you could fall into. I mean, I just love a woman's eyes. And the women in her country, when they're outside of that country, they dress like Parisians, and they are just gorgeous. But she wasn't. Have you ever been on a blind date or somebody offered to get you a blind date?
Sort of, yes.
Okay, what was the first question you asked somebody?
What do they look like?
What do they look like? Yeah, exactly. And if the answer is they're sweet, or they have a great sense of humor, or she's really a sweet gal.
They're trying to convince you for a reason.
Right. There's a reason. And this gal was all of that. She was sweet. She had a good sense of humor. And she was also still living with her mother, even though she was in her early 30s. And by that, in her country, that's a sign that you'll be living with your mother for the rest of your life, typically. But a sweet girl. So I've got her in this gorgeous, romantic restaurant, and I didn't try to convince her of anything. Instead, for the next 2 hours, we just talked about our families and our dreams and things like that. And I didn't even attempt to try and recruit her. And after dessert had come and gone and coffee, I'd almost forgotten about my little present, and my foot touched it, and I brought it up and I put it in front of her. And she said, "What's this?" I said, "Something for you to take home." And so she opened it up, looked at it, and I said, "I was hoping that you would take that and put it on your desk at the foreign ministry. And whenever you looked at it, you'd think of me." She's looking at it, and suddenly I see she's crying. And I was confused. I didn't know why she was crying. And I heard her say something, but I couldn't understand what she said. And I leaned in, And I heard her say, "I can do this." I said, "Tell me that again." She said, "I can do this, Jack." I said, "No, I know you can do it, but I don't want you to do it if you don't really want to do it." And I meant that. She said, "No, I can do it." Well, boy, could she do it. She went inside and worked for us for the next 5 years and communicated with us frequently. And what I didn't tell you was what her position was. She was a secretary to the foreign minister. So everything he saw, she saw, and we saw for the next 5 years, including the identity of every one of their intelligence officers undercover worldwide and all of their sensitive negotiating positions worldwide.
Jeez.
Yeah, geez. And then 5 years into that relationship or so, she lost her access, and some knucklehead at headquarters decided, well, no sense having a person get so much a month if they don't have access. And whoever her last handling officer was neglected a cardinal principle that we are trained to do. For instance, if you're working with me, Reed, and you lose your access, I'll give you a recontact plan if you come back into access. And the next time you're outside of your country, you go to a phone booth, you call this number, which is manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you say the following words. You know, you're a friend of Jack Mitchell, yada, 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 and you identify the foreign country you're in, and somebody within the next 3 days will meet you in the main train station at noon, and they'll either be me or be somebody with a picture of me as bona fides. Well, whoever was handling her didn't do that. And she was amicably terminated. We do not terminate with extreme prejudice. And it was about 2 or 3 years later we found out why she had lost her access, and that's because she went into a special training program where she was supervising the installation of all of their sensitive cryptographic communications equipment worldwide, meaning she had the keys to the kingdom. And we did not have a recontact plan for her, to my knowledge. And that was tragic for us.
Jesus, yeah, that would have been.
Oh, and one other thing I didn't tell you. About 6 months after she was amicably terminated, due to a communications snafu, virtually every spy we had in that country was uncovered, rounded up, and shot. And she wasn't. So.
Let me ask, following with that, I don't know if you're allowed to speak to it, but you ever lost an asset?
No. But I have friends who have. I had one friend who asked to have lunch with me and then to walk around the compound at Langley, and he told me that one of the Russian KGB officers that he had recruited was betrayed by Aldrich Ames and shot. And my friend started weeping and said he wouldn't have been shot if it hadn't been for me. And I said, you know, you didn't betray the guy. It was Aldrich Ames. But no, to answer your question, Reed, I never lost an asset, thankfully. It's our top commitment. I'd feel terrible if I lost somebody.
I was going to ask, how do they prepare you guys for that?
Well, you probably would see a counselor, a psychologist, who would talk you through it. But it's part of the risk we take, you know, and you need to make sure that the person doesn't compromise themselves by doing something stupid, like spending the money unwisely, making their neighbors curious why you have sudden wealth. Okay, I'll tell you a good one. In the days after Aldrich Ames, we were not sure who had been compromised, who had been exposed to the KGB. And some people that were working for us, we weren't sure if Ames knew about them or not. So I was in a country where one of these assets of ours came, and we wanted him to just spend 2 or 3 weeks cooling his heels and making sure he was not under scrutiny by the KGB. And so I was the handling officer and make sure that the guy's safe, okay? This guy tells me that he had gone to a bar, had met a Russian girl who was basically a cocktail waitress, and bragged to her that he worked for the CIA. You're shaking your head. Well, I was doing worse than that. I said, in fact, I screamed at the guy. I said, "You did what?" He said, "Yeah, Jack, I told her I worked for the CIA and, just to get her in bed." And I said, "We spend all this money trying to protect you and you go and do that? What an idiot." And the guy, he actually started crying because, Russians are very emotional. Okay, this is kind of a joke, but I say they're like Slavic Italians. Very emotional people, and he's crying and everything. And I thought, how do I get out of this? So I said, okay, here's what you're going to do. I want you to go and meet that young lady tonight, and you confess to her that you lied to her about working for the CIA just to get her in bed. So I meet him a day or so later. He said, "Well, Jack, it worked." She said she didn't believe me. And he says, "Guess what? We went to bed again." I was so honest.
She loved an honest man.
I loved an honest man. But I was thinking, how are we going to get out of this? He's telling a Russian bimbo that he works for the CIA, and we're trying to protect him. But yeah, people do stupid things.
What's the process that happens if someone does get made? Is there usually an extraction or? Well,
we try. You may have read about when we uncovered the 10 American illegals back in the year 2010. They were deep cover Russian intelligence officers posing as Americans or other third nationals. And the FBI arrested all of them, and then we swapped them for some of the people that the Russians had arrested. So we will do a swap. Sometimes. Now, but often the Russians will simply arrest somebody so that they can have a bargaining chip. You probably recall a year or so ago, Brittany Griner, the basketball player, she made a horrible mistake of taking some vaping equipment into Russia where it's strictly forbidden, but would have been a misdemeanor crime probably in the U.S. Well, she's arrested, held in, and then was swapped for Victor Bout, who is the merchant of death. Victor Bout, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but you know who I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. This guy, merchant of death. And so we ended up having to swap her. They swapped her for him. They were really wanting him out because he knew a lot. He'd been in prison for 8 or 9, 10 years. But the Russians will they'll serially arrest people. Sometimes they actually catch a spy. But if we can we'll try and get them out. Yeah.
So going back to the beginning, we originally were going through all the interview process and everything. The next step was the farm. So can you explain what the farm was and I guess your process there?
That's the nickname for the training facility that we have. It's in a rural area. I can't tell you where because it's still classified, although the entire world knows where it is. But we refer to it as the farm because it's so rural out there. And it's about anywhere from I think I was in there for about 4 months of training. Now, you're not there for the entire 4 months. You typically come home on weekends and can be with your family. But you're taught clandestine tradecraft. You're taught surveillance detection routes. That means, am I under surveillance or not? It's a basic surveillance detection course. We have more advanced courses if you're going to a hostile environment like Russia or China. Then you get weeks of training. In fact, we train with the FBI. They work against us to train us how to detect surveillance and abort if we think that we're under surveillance. So you're trained in that, trained in clandestine photography, you're trained in a lot of things. And one of the key things is basically how to recruit people, how to conduct a meeting, how to write up an intelligence report. Now, a lot of it, at least for me, was basically common sense. I knew how to recruit people in a sense, but they can refine it and structure it, and so you role play against instructors who are experienced CIA officers, and they're there. They take you through a number of exercises and try and build your self-confidence, and then they critique your performance after each exercise. And then at the end of the 4 months, if you pass, you pass, but there's always a few that don't pass. They're just not suited for, or they can select out themselves. If they get into it and they think, this just isn't for me, then they can, what we call self-select out. but there's usually a small handful that are not certified as operations officers. We don't fire them. We try and find them another job because there are a lot of other jobs that need doing other than being an operations officer. There are some people that just don't like the recruitment process, but they're excellent at handling clandestine sources. So we shouldn't exclude those people because we need people who are good handlers or who excel in some other area. So the great thing about working for CIA is there's so many interesting jobs, we can probably find something for you. And you may not be good at operations or may not be good at recruiting, but there's a lot of other jobs that need to be done.
Is there anything specific, or I guess, what was your favorite part about the farm to the level that you're comfortable going into detail?
Sure. Well, there was one exercise that I think I can talk about because you're basically, the scenario is you're in a fictional country. They make up a name for this country, and you're an American CIA officer there undercover, and you're working a target played by an instructor, okay? So there was this one exercise where we'd had 2 or 3 meetings of developing the instructor. That means trying to build the trust and seeing what the instructor's access is to whatever organization he claimed to be with, probably foreign ministry, or it could have been some government official. Okay. What the students didn't know was that the instructors were all going to reveal after the pitch that they were actually part of the security service of that country. And they were then going to pull out the handcuffs and arrest us and see how we reacted under pressure. We've just been arrested by the internal security department of this fictitious foreign country. How would we react to suddenly being under arrest and then interrogated somewhere? So that was what was supposed to happen. But when my instructor whipped out his credentials showing that he was a colonel in the secret police, I leaned forward and said, "That is the best news I've had all day. You are so much better qualified to do what I want you to do." And I leaned in, and he said to me later, he said, "Jim, I felt like a bird in front of a snake." And he slowly put away his credentials and his handcuffs, and I recruited him.
Really?
And I was the only one out of 30 students to recruit the target. But he said, "I couldn't help it." He said, "You had me, and it was so persuasive that I felt good working for you." So that was my most memorable.
That's awesome. So would you say that was a moment or at some point in the farm where you really felt like you found the right gig? Like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I knew this was my calling. You know, that's what a vocation is, a calling.
Mm-hmm.
As I told you earlier in the program, I backed into this by accident. I was never intentionally going to join the CIA when I was in school, but through great good fortune, I found a job that I'm really good at. I gave a talk out at NSA, National Security Agency, about 8 or 9 years ago on their Counterintelligence and Security Awareness Day. There were probably 500 or 600 people in the auditorium. And I told a series of stories similar to what I've told you today, although they included more classified details. And at the end of that talk, a young man in the back raised his hand and he asked me, "Mr. Lawler, do you consider yourself to be a moral person?" And I said, "That's a great question, one I've often asked myself. But I've decided that a young Marine Corps sniper who takes an Al-Qaeda bomb maker into his sights at 1,000 yards, he's a moral person. And as long as I do this for national security reasons, I'm a moral person. But where it becomes immoral is how much I enjoy it." And maybe that young Marine Corps sniper does too. I don't know. But I've loved what I did.
Can you speak to that a little bit more in terms of tiptoeing that line between?
Well, somebody once said, "Lawler, you're nothing but a sociopath, but one within lanes." The lanes are U.S. laws. And when a CIA officer gets in trouble, it's because they stray out of those lanes. But no, I enjoy recruiting people, in essence, controlling people. And that's the bizarre thing, is that we who are so condemning of traitors, but my job is to recruit traitors and then to bring them into our fold and make them part of our team. And a lot of people can't do that, but I did it. I did it pretty well, and I enjoyed it. And now I write about it. In fact, all of my books, my novels are about that very thing.
Well, I saw you say that in the team house where you said, you dream about it, just being able to still take part. And I know you spoke about this on Julian's podcast as well, the idea of I can never pronounce this word right, sociopathy or sociopathy.
Sociopathy, yeah.
Sociopathy. In a way, we were talking about the qualities at the top of the show. Do you think, at least to reach the level that you were at, that type of quality has to be in there?
Yes. Now, if you could ask, I've had a couple of my good friends are forensic psychiatrists. And I doubt that they would call me a true sociopath. I use that a little bit hyperbole. But the fact is there are very few things I won't do to get a target to work for me. I won't. Of course, I'm not going to go after somebody who's very young. I do have some moral scruples. I'm not going to sleep with an asset. I have a wonderful wife that I love. I've been married 49 years, and sometimes some of our officers have done that, gets them in trouble. So there are some things I won't do, but I enjoyed it a lot. The fact that I could steal intelligence that was vital to our national security. A lot of my career in the latter half of my time at CIA was working against weapons of mass destruction programs. And if you can defeat a country that wants to have a nuclear weapon, well, that's psychologically righteous. That's important. That's worth doing. When we brought down the AQ Khan network, they were basically supplying Libya with techniques, the means, the know-how, the plans for a 15-kiloton nuclear weapon, which was the same as the one that destroyed Hiroshima and killed 140,000 people. So I think that that's definitely something that is righteous, that's worth doing. And when Gaddafi was overthrown in the year 2011, one of my analyst friends said, Jim, imagine if you and your team had not basically prevented Libya from getting a nuclear weapon, Gaddafi would have used them against his own people probably. I hadn't thought about that before. But there are a lot of national security issues, and I'm very proud that we did what we did.
So you would say where the moral questions come in, is it more about the positives that you'll bring to the U.S. versus the negatives or kind of taking down the evil of a country?
Right. And one thing people mistakenly assume is that the CIA is like a cannon rolling around on the deck or a rogue elephant. We do not do things that are not ordered by the White House. Now, we've done some things that may be stupid or bad or ill-prepared. The Bay of Pigs is a classic example. But that was on the order of the president. We didn't just come up with this idea, let's go invade Cuba. No, all of the things that we do in that respect, they're ordered by the National Security Council and the White House. Everything I did was blessed by the White House. I've briefed President Bush. I've briefed Vice President Cheney, and they were absolutely supportive. I've briefed leaders of both parties in Congress, both the Speaker of the House, both the ranking members on the intelligence committees, and it didn't matter if they were Republicans or Democrats. They were uniformly supportive of what we were doing.
So I guess in terms of blending or tiptoeing some of these lines, does that fall on the case officer, and to what extent?
If you think, well, okay, that's where Office of General Counsel, our lawyers, would provide guidance. If this is within National Security Council or presidential, we have something called a Presidential Memorandum of Notification, meaning that the president can authorize things for the CIA to do, which technically are against the law, but he's given you a get-out-of-jail-free card because of national security interests. And as long as you adhere to the guidelines that the Office of General Counsel and our, management puts out, you're okay.
Mm-hmm. So if what you highlighted, the decision to sleep with an asset to be like the James Bond or whatever, that can fall on the individual, or does that usually have to actually be discussed?
Well, that'll get you in a lot of trouble,
So that is
especially if you sleep with a foreign national from a country like Russia or China.
Mm-hmm.
Worst thing you can possibly do. Will you get fired? No, but your career is going to suffer,
Right.
and you will be yanked out of the. I mean, we've had people yanked out of China or out of Russia because they slept with their language instructor. Well, they're basically putting together what we call a honey trap.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they recruited Clayton Lone Tree, who was a Marine security guard in Russia in Moscow. He fell in love with his Russian language instructor, who then introduced him to Uncle Ivan, and one thing after another, he's compromising things. Fortunately, he confessed to doing it to somebody, but he ended up being sent to prison for a while.
So I guess jumping back ahead, we kind of got really lucky. We went through a lot of different case officer deployments. You did mention the AQCON nuclear network, which I do want to get into, but I guess just to start off the story. So in the end of the 90s, you took over the counter-proliferation network, correct, for the CIA?
Well, I was the deputy chief of operations for the counter-proliferation division. And then I was asked by the head of the division, the head of counterproliferation division, to take on a special project to penetrate foreign nuclear weapons programs. And so that's what ultimately led to us discovering and penetrating and destroying the AQCON network.
So can you describe, I guess, what the counterproliferation is and why it's such a vital aspect for the U.S.?
Counterproliferation is we don't want to have countries that don't have nuclear weapons to acquire nuclear weapons, or advanced biological weapons, or advanced chemical weapons. We know, of course, that the Russians have all of those, but we don't want the Irans, the Syrias, the other countries, clearly Cuba, other adversary countries, or even friendly countries. We don't really want the friendly countries to have nuclear weapons as well. The more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the chances someone's going to use them. For instance, I have worked steadily against the Iranian nuclear weapons program, but if you ask me, Jim, would it be the end of the world if Iran had nuclear weapons just by itself? Well, we know for a fact, pretty much, that Israel has a lot of nuclear weapons and that Iran would not be stupid enough to launch a nuclear attack on Tel Aviv or Jerusalem without fearing that they would be wiped off the map. My fear is that if Iran has a nuclear weapon, that the Saudis, the Turks, the Emiratis, everybody in the area will feel compelled to also have nuclear weapons. And the more countries you have that have those weapons, the greater the chances increase, probably dramatically, that somebody's either going to intentionally or accidentally use those weapons. And once that's going off, we're going to have all hell to pay. Mm-hmm. So counter-proliferation means stopping the proliferation of these WMD, weapons of mass destruction technologies, to these countries that shouldn't have them.
Is there a worry? I mean, I remember growing up too in the New York, New Jersey area, there was always talk about a possibility of a lone wolf type actor. Is that a focus as well?
That's more of a FBI issue, but my fear on the lone wolf is more from a biological weapons capability. Mm. In nuclear weapons, you have a choke point, and that choke point is called fissile material. If you don't have uranium-235 or plutonium-239, you don't have a nuclear weapon. Not only do you need the material, the nuclear material, but you have to have the design criteria, how to put it together, and that's pretty sophisticated. Biological weapons, on the other hand, we saw what Bruce Ivins did in the Amerithrax case in 2001, killed 13 people and cost us $1.5 billion in cleaning up. And he was just one scientist. Now, had he designed, and he could have because he was a very talented scientist, had he designed something very sophisticated, he could have killed thousands of people. That knowledge is fairly ubiquitous in the United States. There's a lot of people that have his level of biological weapons, or let's say pathology, knowing how to work with certain pathogens and things like that. I think so. It's a lot more possible that someone could design, for some warped reason, a biological weapon than it is a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm. What about the traffic that happens, I guess, outside the U.S., where weapons are either being sold from nation to nation? I mean, is that a lot of tracking as well? Are you worried about
that? Actually is a plot point in my first book, Living Lies, where some nuclear weapons, basically fissile material, the uranium-235, which is hard to get, basically leaks out of the former Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And Iran, in my fictional scenario, buys it, and so then has the means to construct several nuclear weapons. So to get a shortcut to a nuclear weapon is by basically getting the material, and then if you have a design, then you've got a weapon.
So jumping into the AQ-Khan, the nuclear program, can you kind of explain what that was and the breakdown of the process there?
Well, Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan, AQ-Khan, was a Pakistani. He had been, when India and Pakistan went through the partition, I think it was in 1947, a lot of ethnic Muslims were expelled from India, and it became the country that's known as Pakistan. At one time, there was both East and West Pakistan. East Pakistan became Bangladesh. The one that was the concerning one was West Pakistan. And Dr. Khan was a very bright scientist who was working for a group in Europe called the Uranium Enrichment Corporation. This was a consortium of the Dutch, the British, and the Germans, and they manufactured a very special process for enriching uranium, not for nuclear weapons, but for power, peaceful power purposes, for nuclear power plants. And so Dr. Khan was working with the Urenco Corporation as a subcontractor, and he was very concerned about the fact that India had tested a nuclear weapon in the early 70s, and he contacted the Pakistani government, the Indians' archenemy, and offered to steal this very sophisticated centrifuge enrichment technology from his employer and bring it to Pakistan. And he did so. He stole all the plans for these ultracentrifuges, which are used to enrich uranium from the natural uranium content of U-235 of 0.7% up to somewhere between 80 and 90% for weapons grade. And it's a process of running gas through these ultracentrifuges through a process, and eventually you get the highly enriched uranium. So he brought that technique back, established Khan Research Laboratories in Kahuta in Pakistan, and Pakistan then acquired the capability of having nuclear weapons. Where it went off the rails, however, was he decided to take proliferation private and offer that same nuclear weapons technology to Libya, which, as you may recall, when Gaddafi was head of Libya, Libya was considered to be a rogue country and a state supporter of terrorism. So my group that CIA had me put together was able to discover what Dr. Khan and his network, which had no official Pakistani blessing, this was all Dr. Khan himself doing this for his own self-enrichment and his own ego. We penetrated the organization and gradually over time were able to disrupt it, to reveal what was going on, and then that led to the disarmament in Libya where Gaddafi surrendered the nuclear weapons technology. But it was the most dangerous nuclear weapons proliferation in history. We penetrated it. I recruited a number of assets within the organization, and then they revealed what was going on. And there was a famous shipment in the year 2003, I believe. It might have been, no, it was 2004. The BBC China, which was loaded with hundreds of thousands of nuclear components. And because I knew from my assets where this was going, we were able to seize that ship, seize all the containers on it. And then that brought the Libyan program to a halt, and they disarmed.
Let me ask you this. When you're recruiting assets in a situation like that, and this is something you maybe see in like a movie where they go to bad guy and they say, hey, this is, you're no longer playing for, hey, get some money. Like this could be a world level crisis. Is that something you
That's
bring in the
almost
ballgame?
exactly the pitch I did.
Mm-hmm.
I pitched the head of this one group in the network, and I promised him security guarantees and ample financial rewards. We knew that he wanted out of this anyways, wanted out of this proliferation game. And ultimately he said, well, can I think about it tonight? And I said, no, if you walk out of this room without saying yes, then I can't help you. But right now you have the chance to change history. You yourself come over to my side and change history. And he did.
That's fascinating. So I guess looking from your perspective, Iranian nuclear deal, and with that, just recently the president died in a helicopter accident. I mean, what do you think about the situation that we've been seeing in Iran? It's gone from 2 years ago, there was all those protests, and it's a pretty hectic country.
I'd say a large percentage of the Iranian population are very unhappy with the mullahs, very unhappy with the government. And of course, the Iranian government fears that they would be overthrown. I don't know what percentage of the Iranian population actually supports this theocratic, fanatical government, but I bet you it doesn't exceed 30%. Most Iranians are very bright people and are sensible people. We have a lot of them have immigrated to the United States where they are doctors or academicians, scientists. They come from a country of a lot of technological advances. But I fear, I don't think there's any sudden change in the Iranian government. I have no delight that their president was killed. He'll be replaced by somebody else, probably just as fanatical or maybe even worse. I think eventually, the government will have to listen to the people at some point. They could be overthrown. We've seen revolutions before. They conducted a revolution against the Shah. There's no reason to say why they may not be overthrown as well. But they have an iron grip on the country, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, along with the mullahs and certain influential people. They keep a chokehold on that country. It's sad, very sad.
Mm-hmm. Well, the question being, too, Israel time and time again is saying that, as they get closer to being able to produce the bomb, that they're at a certain level that they're going to either conduct airstrikes, they're going to do something. Is there a lot of difficulty with communication or working, especially from proliferation background, in terms of operating with Mossad and trying to find that balance there?
Well, I think I can safely say we do work closely with our allies, Mossad being one of them. We have common interests in preventing the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. The Iranians are very cagey and playing very coyly. They're, a lot of estimates are that they would be only months away if they decided to go to a bomb. They've already enriched their uranium to 60%. They don't have to go much further and to get it up to weapons grade. They probably have designs. So if they decided to break out, it could be a matter of just a few months.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that would be, we wouldn't know that unless we had a spy, as in my book, Living Lies, talks about if we penetrate and we know that or if they test. If they test, we're going to know it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the question then, from your perspective. How do we stop Israel do we stop Israel from doing some type of all-out preventative attack like they've discussed before?
Great question. That's the kind of thing that the president or the National Security Council would have to think. The problem with doing that is the Iranians have cleverly located these facilities frequently underground. And so the Israelis would almost have to use, if not a nuclear weapon, they'd have to use one of those blockbuster type things we used to. Exactly. And I'm not even sure if that would be effective. It's a challenging question.
Mm-hmm. I guess for not necessarily fun, but just out of curiosity, what's your view on Mossad versus CIA? The differences,
Mossad is differences. I'll just say this without trying to make a comparison. Mossad is very focused for them, national security is an existential crisis. If they fail, we saw what happened on October 7th, a lot of people killed. 3,000, I think it was something like 3,000 Israelis were either killed or captured or wounded. It's an existential issue. And so Mossad, they don't mess around. They're very serious. They're very focused. They're not supermen, but I've worked with Mossad, and they're very sharp and very passionate and dedicated, as they should be.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I guess on a global scale, it's always kind of the tried and true history of KGB versus CIA. Obviously, Soviet Union isn't around anymore. Who do you think our biggest competitors are now, or the ones that we have to keep the eyes on most constantly?
Certainly the Russians and the Chinese, to a lesser extent the Iranians and some of the lesser players, Syrians. But Russians and Chinese, I think, are the two challenges. A lot of people, young people, ask me how to get into the CIA, and I said, well, if you've got a hard language like either Chinese or Russian or Arabic or Farsi, those are all great, because you can take somebody like me out of Texas and you can teach me a certain amount of how to speak that language. But if you've already got that language, it's great. But I'd say the Russians and the Chinese are our two primary challenges, primary adversaries. In fact, the Russians refer to us as Glavny protivnik, the main adversary.
Mm-hmm. How do you think China differs in terms of their approach? And because I feel like that's not other than the weather balloon that was over the country, it's not in the topic of conversation as much.
China has vast resources, human resources, technological resources that they're willing to throw against the problem. I think they're probably even better at cyber than the Russians. They have huge resources, both the Ministry for State Security, MSS, and their People's Liberation Army intelligence units. They're very good. Man for man, woman for woman, are they as good as CIA? No, probably not, but they outnumber us by quite a bit. The Russians are a little bit more, they're great too. The Russian, the SVR, which is their foreign intelligence unit, the FSB, which is the internal equivalent to FBI, although they also have responsibility for the countries around Russia. And then the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, they do a lot of sophisticated intelligence operations. In fact, I had a good friend of mine who was in Russian operations, and he had a great saying. He said, not only are they playing both sides of the board, we don't even see the board sometimes. He was being a little funny. And I describe it in my new novel as trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So let me ask, how do you think espionage has changed since your time in the CIA and especially now?
Excellent question. There's certainly much more in the way of technology, but will technology replace human intelligence? In my opinion, no. But for instance, when I came back from overseas in 1994 and went to work full-time at CIA headquarters, the internet was just in its infancy. Now, the internet is so common that my phone, everything else I can access. If I meet you and you tell me your name and your company, I'll do an internet research thing and see if you're legitimate or not. So the ability for someone such as myself to travel an alias and pose as an oil and gas commodities trader is circumscribed considerably if you can simply look Jim up on LinkedIn and see, or whatever name I've given you. And if I've given you a name and I'm not on LinkedIn, and I should be, or I don't have any internet presence, you're going to think this is phony. Something's wrong here. So things have changed. Other things that have changed is what we call ubiquitous technical surveillance, meaning cameras everywhere, meaning biometric readers, meaning facial recognition readers, things like that. So is this a insurmountable barrier? No. It's just as much of a challenge for our adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, as it is for us. And so we have to be smarter and swifter. I know Mossad's key counterintelligence principle is swiftness. Get in, get out, get it done. And I think that's a good rule. Get it done quickly. But be aware of the technical challenges. Now, people have asked me about AI. In fact, my friend Shawnee Delaney, whom I mentioned earlier, she and I are writing an article for a journal, and the title of the article is Human Dead in the Age of AI, in the Age of Artificial Intelligence? And we're going to probably come to a conclusion that artificial intelligence does pose challenges, but it also can gather incredible amounts of targeting material on a target. If I had AI resources, I can vacuum up all the information everywhere about somebody and have it make some conclusions and at least point me in the right direction as to how I might make a recruitment approach. If I find out that you're heavy into gambling, that you're going through marital issues, that you may have some medical issues, things like that, all stress points, vulnerabilities, or that you're on your social media. Think of all the social media that you're on where you make some mention of the fact that you like to play lacrosse. Maybe you're a member of a lacrosse team, an amateur one now that you're out of college, but I want to get close to you, so I'm going to learn how to play lacrosse and maybe work, to get to know you. Or I find out that you play tennis or you do something and you got that on your social media, on Facebook or on LinkedIn. That gives me great target assessment. It's what we used to call an access agent. If I want to recruit Reed and I don't know Reed, but I know Paul, who's one of Reed's best friends, and I can recruit Paul to tell me all about Reed and what his stress points are, that's called an access agent. Nowadays, with social media, I don't need access agents typically. You're putting it out there yourself.
So the discussion with AI, though, are you worried about the ability to maintain encryption, a lot of those different systems?
That's actually in my third book. Yes, quantum computing could pose a challenge to encryption. Theoretically, if we get I think what they call it, a computer-relevant quantum computer, it'll make encryption irrelevant. That what would have taken millions of years could take hours to break encryption. Not only is that a challenge to governments protecting their secrets, but it's a challenge to banks and everybody else and companies, credit cards, things like that. If that encryption is broken, we're going to get looted, both intellectually and financially, be looted. So we need to stay ahead of that. I hope we can develop the quantum, and if we develop it, then there'll be some kind of defense that we can maintain as well.
Mm-hmm. So about AI videos and photos, I'm sure you've seen, the quality over just in a year has become, you almost can't distinguish. Do you see
if anybody sees me in a little pink tutu, that's not really me.
That's exactly what I was going to say is there considerations about utilizing these to be able to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then, the Russians, the Chinese, they're already doing it. This is called a, degradation, denigration campaign. I want to denigrate somebody, cause doubt in the group that he's in, so I construct AI videos showing him consorting with their enemies. People have been doing that for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. But now AI makes it much more possible that it's actually believable. You're looking at this and you're seeing your trusted friend, and here he is with these guys, and
and play that game.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess continuation with this, we were just talking about China and Russia, our two biggest foes in this arena. And China itself, over the past decade, has really become a centralized state in terms of intelligence. Yeah. They have cameras on every corner. You have social credit scores, items like that. If I was to take you as an agent right now and saying that we're going to be dropping you into that area, or if you're just recruited or case officer, whatever it might be, how would you game plan to be able to operate in a place like China at its current state?
With a lot of difficulty. I do have friends who speak fluent Chinese, near native level Chinese, and we do fortunately recruit ethnic Chinese case officers like we try. You talk about diverse government organizations. Diversity is not just a hollow word for us. We don't do it simply to be cute and politically correct. We do it because we need it. If I want somebody to know what a Chinese target is thinking and all the nuances of the language, I want somebody who has probably been brought up as Chinese or at least immersed in the culture and the language, much more than some kid from Texas like I was. So
awesome. I really appreciate that, James. And like I said, today was an awesome conversation. I'm definitely going to get you down to Dallas at some point. Maybe I'll let you stop through Houston or something first. But I appreciate a lot of the answers on this. And I guess just wrapping up here is, if someone's looking to become a CIA spy or wanting to get involved in the agency, what would be your main takeaway or tip for that person?
I would say make sure you've got a good, strong undergraduate degree and preferably a graduate degree. And then any foreign language that you have, any foreign language, again, Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, Russian are the best, but certainly if you speak Spanish or French or Italian or German, anything like that is also a big advantage. Having a curiosity about foreign cultures. And if you've got any questions, I think Reed could put you in touch with me. I could be happy. He's got my email address, and I'd be happy to answer those questions. I do it all the time, sometimes several times a week, either by phone or if you're in the Washington area, I don't mind meeting somebody for coffee and chatting. And of course, if anybody's interested in my spy novels, they're available on Amazon. Maybe Reed can show you the two. There's Living Lies, the first one, and The Twinkling of an Eye is the second. And I hope to get my third one out later this year in the fall, and that one is called The Traitor's Tale.
I'm pumped up for that one. And all the links will be below when that third one comes out. We'll talk again. And then, like I said, we'll get you down to Dallas. But again, thank you so much for today. And looking forward to the next one.
It was a pleasure, Reed, and something tells me you would be a good case officer.
I appreciate that. That would be fun.